The Mont Blanc pen hovered just a fraction of an inch above the signature line, but to Alric Dunveil, it felt like a 1,000-pound anchor dragging him into the abyss. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 50th floor boardroom, a rhythmic, violent thrumming that matched the frantic pounding in his chest. Outside, the city was a blur of gray and neon. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, a toxic blend of expensive leather, aged scotch, and the sharp metallic tang of suppressed rage. His lieutenants, Hayes Relin and Jude Morrow, sat like statues around the mahogany table, their eyes tracking the movement of the pen with the patient hunger of vultures. For 10 years, Alric had ruled the Dunveil syndicate with a fist of iron and a heart of stone. He had built an empire on silence and shadows, but today that empire was bleeding out. Every territory was going dark, and the insolvency agreement on the table was his final play, a $2 billion trap designed to liquidate his rivals and cement his dominance forever. Alric's hand, heavily tattooed with the Dunveil crest and scarred from decades of street wars, gripped the pen hard enough to snap the casing. Sweat gathered at his temple. His underling, Korean Mafia had spent weeks whispering that this was the only way to clean up the loose ends. One signature, one order, one hit to silence the final witness and save the legacy. He began to lower the nib, the ink ready to seal a fate he couldn't take back. But just as the metal touched the paper, a hand, small, trembling, but impossibly resolute, slammed down directly onto the contract. "Don't," a voice whispered, cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Alric froze, his cold predator eyes snapping up to meet the gaze of Tracy, the waitress. She wasn't looking at the guards or the guns tucked into waistbands. She was locking eyes with the coordinates buried in the fine print of the document. "If you sign this," she said, her voice shaking with fierce urgency, "your men strike Section 4. My sister is there, and so is Isla." The room went ice cold. The name Isla hung in the air like a ghost. The dragon had been stopped by a servant, and the secret Alric had buried for a decade was now the only thing that could destroy him. The boardroom became a vacuum, the only sound the frantic gasping of the executives and the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. Alric Dunveil didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the dark, slender hand pinned against his $2 billion contract, a stark contrast to the white linen and mahogany. Slowly he looked up, his gaze a cold blade that it made men twice Tracy's size plead for mercy. But the waitress didn't flinch. Her breathing was shallow, her simple service vest rising and falling rapidly, but her eyes, fierce and intelligent, locked onto his with an urgency that defied the social order of the room. "Move your hand," Korean Mafia hissed, his chair screeching against the floor as he stood, reaching for the holster hidden beneath his tailored jacket. The two men in suits at the far end of the table stared in paralyzed shock, their faces pale, watching the ultimate social transgression unfold. To touch a man like Alric was a death sentence. To interrupt him was unthinkable. "You don't understand," Tracy whispered, her voice cracking but holding its ground against the suffocating pressure of the room. She didn't look at Koren's weapon, she looked only at Alric, seeing past the dragon persona to the weary man beneath the tattoos. "I know this routing code. I grew up in Section 4. I saw what your business did to my family years ago, and I stayed silent, but I won't stay silent for this." Alric leaned back, his knuckles scarred and white as he gripped the arms of his chair. "You are a ghost in a polyester vest, Tracy," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Why should I listen to a ghost?" "Because this isn't an insolvency agreement," she countered, her finger tapping the fine print with prophetic certainty. "It's a coordinate map for a strike, and if you sign that paper, you aren't just destroying a neighborhood, you are killing the only person who still remembers you as a man, not a monster." She leaned closer, ignoring the collective intake of breath from the onlookers. Isla is there, Alric. She's at the community center in Section 4. Your hitmen are already moving, and your pen is the only thing giving them the signal to fire. The air in the room turned to ice. Alric felt the metallic tang of desperation rise in his throat, a sensation he hadn't felt in decades. The prophet in the waitress's uniform had just stripped away his armor, leaving him exposed to a truth more terrifying than any federal trap. He looked at the pen, then at the woman risking her life to speak it, and for the first time the boss realized his violence was about to destroy the only thing he had ever truly loved. The roar of the engine drowned out the storm as Alric's black sedan tore through the rain-slicked streets of Section 4, a ghost ship navigating a sea of neon and shadows. Beside him, Tracy gripped the dashboard, her face pale but her eyes fixed forward, acting as a compass through the labyrinth of the neighborhood his syndicate had once crushed. Every second felt like a blade twisting in Alric's gut. He had spent a decade building a machinery of death, and now he was racing to stop its gears from grinding over his own flesh and blood. They skidded to a halt in front of the community center, the tires screaming against the asphalt. The building was a humble sanctuary of brick and peeling paint, standing in stark defiance of the surrounding decay. Alric didn't wait for the car to fully stop before he was out in the deluge, his expensive suit soaking through instantly, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal. He saw them then, the silhouettes of his own men, Hayes Rellan and Jude Morrow's team, positioned like vultures on the rooftops and in the shadows of the alleyways. "Hold your fire!" Alric roared, his voice cracking against the wind, but the rain swallowed his command. Through the large front window of the center, he saw her. Isla was standing by a table, her silhouette soft against the flickering fluorescent lights inside. She was laughing, oblivious to the world of iron and lead closing in around her. Then Alric saw it, a tiny dancing spark of crimson light. The red dot of a laser sight drifted upward, steady and cold, finally settling directly over Isla's heart. Time seemed to fracture. The dragon who had ruled by the gun felt a sudden paralyzing terror that no rival boss had ever managed to instill. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was a father, watching the shadow of his own sins prepare to strike. Across the street, he caught the glint of a barrel protruding from a second-story window. Corinne Laveau's orders were absolute. Silence the witness. Alric lunged forward, his boots splashing through deep puddles, his hand reaching out as if he could physically grab the air and pull it back. He was too far to reach the door, too slow to call the hit off. As the sniper's finger began to squeeze the trigger, Alric realized with a shattering clarity that the only way to save the life he had once abandoned was to throw his own into the path of the storm he had created. The glass shattered with a sound like 1,000 falling diamonds, a jagged explosion that tore through the quiet sanctity of the community center. Alric didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds or the weight of his legacy. He simply threw himself through the jagged frame, his body a heavy, desperate projectile of meat and bone. He hit the floor sliding, the linoleum slick with rain and glass, and reached for Isla just as the first crack of the sniper's rifle echoed through the street. Isla gasped, her eyes wide with a sudden paralyzing confusion as a man covered in tattoos and drenched in the storm tackled her to the ground. Alric felt the searing heat of the bullet as it hissed past his ear, slamming into a wooden bookshelf behind them. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her small frame into the hollow of his chest, shielding her with every inch of his scarred back. For the first time in a decade, he held his daughter, but there was no warmth in the reunion, only the cold, hard reality of the justice he had spent his life perfecting. Another round punched through the wall, splintering the brickwork just inches above his head. Alric pressed Isla's face into his shoulder, his hands trembling as he felt the frantic, bird-like rhythm of her heart against his own. He was the shield now, a wall of flesh intended to stop the very lead he had paid for. Outside, he could hear the boots of his men hitting the pavement, the mechanical clicking of magazines being seated, sounds that at once brought him a sense of power, but now sounded like the ticking of a death clock. "Who are you?" Isla whispered into the fabric of his soaked suit, her voice trembling with a terror that broke what was left of his heart. Alric didn't answer. He couldn't. He just held her tighter, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the shadows of his own creation to step into the light. He realized then that he wasn't just protecting her from a bullet, he was trying to hold back the tide of a life built on blood. As the red laser sights began to dance across the floor again, searching for a gap in his defense, the dragon understood the true cost of his crown. He was willing to be the target, willing to be the sacrifice, if it meant the girl in his arms never had to know the monster who had saved her. The sirens wailed in the distance, a rising chorus that signaled the end of the world Alric had spent a lifetime building. Inside the community center, he remained crouched on the glass-strewn floor, his body a heavy canopy over Isla. The radio on his belt crackled with static, a jagged, hateful sound that carried the voice of Corin Laveau. It wasn't the voice of a loyal underling anymore. It was the cold, clinical tone of a successor who had already moved on from the corpse of his mentor. Corin revealed that the insolvency agreement was never about saving the men. It was a coordinated strike to decapitate the old guard and liquidate the syndicate's assets into Corin's private accounts. Alric realized with a sickening clarity that he had been the architect of his own ambush, having trusted the very rot that was now eating his legacy alive. "The dragon is dead, Alric." Corin's voice hissed through the speaker, devoid of the feigned respect of the boardroom. "You became weak the moment you remembered you had a heart. Now we finish the job." Alric looked down at Isla, who was staring at the Dunveil crest tattooed on his hand with a dawning, horrific recognition. The crown he wore, the power, the fear, the billions in blood money was the very thing drawing the fire toward her. As long as he remained the boss, as long as the syndicate existed, she would never be anything more than a target or a bargaining chip. To save her, he didn't just need to fight off a hit squad, he had to burn the throne to the ground. He realized that the only way to truly protect her was to lose everything he had ever fought for, his status, his wealth, and his shadow empire. He reached for his phone, not to call for reinforcements, but to dial the one number he had spent 20 years avoiding. He began to dictate the encrypted access codes to his digital offshore accounts, the ones Corin desperately needed to finalize the coup. Alric wasn't surrendering to Corin. He was feeding the information to the federal task force waiting in the wings. He watched the red dots of the laser sights retreat from Isla's chest as the snipers outside realized the game had changed. The cost of her life was his total ruin, and as he felt the weight of the crown finally slip from his brow, Alric Dunveil breathed for the first time in a decade. The safe house was a hollow shell of concrete and shadows, tucked away in a corner of the city where even the rain seemed to lose its strength. Alric sat in the corner, his silhouette blending into the damp walls, watching Isla as she sat by a single flickering lamp. The air was thick with the smell of wet dust and the iron tang of his own blood, yet the silence between them was far more piercing than the gunfire they had left behind. Tracy stood by the door, a silent sentinel, her eyes moving between the broken man and the daughter who didn't know she was being guarded by the very source of her nightmares. Isla pulled a thin, moth-eaten blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the floor. "He's out there somewhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. "The man who owns the streets. The one they call the dragon." She looked up, her eyes bright with a mixture of hatred and exhaustion, unaware that the monster she spoke of was bleeding just 6 feet away. "My mother used to say he was a man who traded his soul for a kingdom of ghosts. She called him a monster who built a world where nothing innocent is allowed to grow." Alric flinched as if struck, the words cutting deeper than any blade Hayes or Jude had ever leveled against him. He stayed in the shadows, his tattooed hands hidden in his lap, listening as his daughter described the shadow he had cast over her entire life. She spoke of the fear that lived in the architecture of the city, the families crushed under the weight of his business, and the father who had abandoned her to be raised by a syndicate's collateral damage. Each word was a mirror held up to his face, reflecting a creature of greed and violence that he could no longer recognize as himself. "I used to wish he'd come back," Isla continued, her voice hardening into a jagged edge. "But now, I just wish he'd burn with the rest of it. He thinks he's a god because he has the power to destroy, but he's just a coward who hides behind paper and pens." Alric closed his eyes, the darkness of the safe house finally matching the darkness within his own chest. He realized then that the prophecy Tracy had whispered in the boardroom was complete. He had saved Isla's life, but he had already lost her heart to the legend of his own cruelty. As the night deepened, he understood that he couldn't just shield her from bullets. He had to find a way to kill the dragon so that the father might finally be allowed to seek forgiveness. The door to the safe house splintered open, but Alric didn't reach for the heavy handgun resting on the crate beside him. Instead, he stood slowly, moving into the dim light of the flickering lamp so his daughter could see him clearly. Corin Laveau stepped through the threshold, flanked by Hayes Relin and Jude Morrow, their weapons raised and trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline and greed. Behind them, the rain continued its indifferent assault on the city, but inside, the air was heavy with the silence of a final reckoning. "Give us the offshore keys, Alric," Corin spat, the barrel of his suppressed pistol aimed squarely at Alric's chest. "End this like the dragon you used to be." Alric looked at the men who had once been his shadows, the men he had taught to equate loyalty with fear. He could feel Isla's terrified gaze on his back, her breath hitching as she watched the monster confront his own kind. For a fleeting second, the old Alric, the predator who had built an empire on the corpses of his enemies, surged to the surface. He knew exactly where Hayes' stance was weak. He knew Jude would hesitate for a heartbeat. He could have ended them all before they pulled their triggers. But he looked at Isla, and then at Tracy, who stood as a silent witness to his choice. If he killed them here, in front of her, he would only be proving her right. He would be the monster she wished would burn. "No," Alric said, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried no hint of threat. He reached out and pushed the handgun off the crate, letting it clatter harmlessly across the concrete floor. "The cycle ends here, Corin. I won't give you the codes, and I won't give you another death to justify your own." Corin's eyes widened in a mixture of confusion and fury. To a man who only spoke the language of violence, Alric's mercy looked like madness. "You're a dead man," Corin hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Maybe," Alric replied, stepping forward until the cold metal of the barrel pressed against his sternum, shielding Isla with his very presence. "But if I die, the accounts stay locked forever. You'll have a throne made of nothing. I'm choosing mercy, not for you, but for the girl behind me. I'm showing her that a man can be something more than what he's destroyed." The stalemate stretched until it felt like the walls themselves would crack. In the eyes of his betrayers, Alric saw the dawning realization that they had no power over a man who had already surrendered his kingdom. By refusing to strike back, the dragon hadn't just spared his enemies, he had finally begun to slay the beast within himself. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy gray shroud over the city, casting a pale, clinical light into the precinct's interrogation room. Alric Dunveil sat at the metal table, the insolvency agreement resting before him like a discarded skin. The document was no longer a contract for a corporate takeover. The margins were filled with his own cramped handwriting, detailing routing numbers, shell companies, and the names of every man who had ever bled for the Dunveil crest. Across from him sat the federal agents he had eluded for 2 decades, their faces etched with a wary, stunned disbelief. They had expected a fight, a high-speed chase, or a silent wall of omerta. Instead, they found a man who had walked through the front doors of the lion's den with his hands open and his head bowed. Alric slid the papers across the table, the mahogany-scented boardroom of his previous life, now a distant, bitter memory. Every dollar, every doc, every life I've touched is in there, Alric said, his voice a gravelly whisper that carried the weight of his total surrender. The insolvency isn't just financial. It's a confession of a soul that has nothing left to lose. He watched through the one-way glass, knowing Tracy and Isla were being led to safety in the hallway beyond. He didn't ask to see them. He didn't ask for a deal. He simply provided the keys to dismantle the gates of the hell he had built, ensuring that Corin Laveau and the rest of the syndicate would find no throne to inherit. As the lead agent picked up the pen to begin the formal processing, Alric felt a strange, terrifying lightness. The dragon was dead, replaced by a man who understood that true power wasn't found in the ability to silence a witness, but in the courage to finally let the truth speak. The heavy steel doors of the processing center groaned shut with a finality that should have felt like a grave, but to Alric Dunveil, it sounded like a liberation. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, a physical weight that paled in comparison to the spiritual lead he had carried for decades. As the guards led him down the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor, the rhythmic echo of his footsteps replaced the thrumming rain of the boardroom, marking the steady pace of a man walking toward his own reckoning. He passed a small, reinforced window that looked out onto the intake courtyard. There, standing near a plain black sedan, were Tracy and Isla. They were smaller than the world he had tried to conquer, yet they were the only things that mattered in the wreckage of his empire. Isla looked toward the building, her expression a complex tapestry of grief, confusion, and a burgeoning, fragile hope. She didn't wave, and Alric didn't expect her to. The distance between them was still measured in years of silence and blood. But she was alive, she was safe, and the red dots of his past had finally been extinguished by his own surrender. Alric felt the dragon dissolve completely as the cell door was unlocked. The tattoos on his hands, the scales and the crest seemed like relics of a dead man, ink trapped on a skin that no longer belonged to a monster. He stepped into the small, cramped space, the 4 walls closing in, yet the suffocating pressure of the 50th floor boardroom was gone. He had traded his mahogany table for a cot and his billion-dollar traps for a clear conscience. As the bolt slid into place, Alric sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands. They were empty, stripped of the Mont Blanc pen and the power to destroy, but for the first time in his life, they were clean. He closed his eyes and breathed in the recycled air of the prison, finding a profound, quiet freedom in the silence. The prisoner was behind bars, but the man was finally home.